Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty fascinating. These notes you sent over titled, The Present Situation in Missions. And I gotta say, this is way more dynamic than I initially thought.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this isn't just some dry historical account. No way.
Right.
I mean, these notes, they paint a really vivid picture of what's happening right now with this whole endeavor of, spreading a specific message across the globe. We're
Yeah.
talking about the impact of, well, I mean, everything really. Population shifts, the global economy, the political landscape is always changing, of course.
Yeah.
Technology, how cultures are evolving, even how religious beliefs are
The
shifting.
whole connected.
Yeah, it's all intertwined. Absolutely.
So let's get started. I guess the nights begin with a bit of a historical overview.
Okay.
And it's interesting because it's easy to think that global missions, it's been going on forever.
Right, right.
But as these notes point out, the modern movement is actually pretty recent, just a couple of centuries, really.
Yeah, that's true.
But there's also this acknowledgement that the desire to connect with people from all nations, that goes way, way back. I mean, much deeper roots.
Yeah, definitely deeper roots. And one thing that really struck me was how this whole thing kind of took off. There was this initial burst of energy and activity, but then things seemed to plateau a bit, maybe as church structures became more established, more, institutionalized.
Okay, so what changed?
Well, I think the notes point to William Carey's journey to India in 1792 as a real turning point, like a reignition of the movement.
Yeah, that's a name that comes up a lot in the history of missions.
Right, and for good reason. His work really had a huge ripple effect.
Yeah.
So moving into the 1800s, things get a bit more complicated, to say the least.
Yeah, this is where the notes get into some pretty sensitive territory.
Definitely sensitive, because you can't talk about the history of missions without addressing the whole issue of European colonization.
Right, and how they're intertwined.
Exactly, intertwined, and it's acknowledged right here. Missionaries going into Africa, India, Southeast Asia, it all happened against the backdrop of colonialism.
And that's something we can't just brush aside.
No, absolutely not. I mean, it's important to recognize that while many individual missionaries were deeply sincere in their faith and their desire to share the gospel, the historical reality of colonialism undoubtedly influenced both their work and how it was received by the people they were trying to reach.
Yeah, it's a complex legacy to unpack.
It is, no doubt.
And then, you get to the 20th century, and it's like the world just gets turned upside down.
Yeah.
2 world wars, the Great Depression. I mean, global travel is disrupted. People are just trying to survive.
Absolutely. So much upheaval.
I can only imagine how that impacted mission efforts.
Oh, it definitely did. I mean, priorities shifted, resources were scarce.
Makes sense.
But then after World War II, something remarkable happens.
Okay, what's that?
There's a resurgence, a renewed sense of purpose, almost a reawakening. The notes describe this growing global consciousness among Western Christians, like a realization that the world is hurting, and maybe, just maybe, it's more open to hearing a message of hope.
I see. So the devastation of war almost created a space for new beginnings.
Yeah, in a way, and it's fascinating because even General MacArthur, in post-war Japan, he actually called for missionaries to come.
Really? Wow, that's pretty surprising.
It is, right. It shows how much the global landscape had shifted.
Yeah.
And here's where it gets even more interesting.
Okay, lay it on me.
The Cold War, with all its ideological divisions, its restrictions, it actually contributed to the spread of missions in unexpected ways.
Oh, so?
Well, you had missionaries being expelled from certain countries, like China, for instance.
Okay.
And they ended up going to places like Southeast Asia, So these limitations in one region actually opened up new opportunities elsewhere.
It's like pushing on a balloon, You press on one side and it bulges out on the other.
Exactly, and I think that speaks to a certain adaptability that has always been a part of the missions movement.
Yeah, makes sense. And so the notes go on to detail this period of growth after 1950. And a lot of emphasis is placed on the increasing leadership of national churches. And then, of course, you have the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89, which was just massive, a huge shift.
Oh, yeah, a seismic shift, no doubt.
And it opened up Eastern Europe like a floodgate. There was this surge of mission activity into those newly accessible areas.
And what's really significant about that period is that it marked a move towards true partnership.
Yeah, less about Western dominance and more about collaboration.
Exactly. It was no longer just about Western missionaries going out and doing their thing. There was this growing emphasis on supporting and working alongside local believers who are now free to operate more openly.
So strengthening those local churches became a central focus.
Absolutely. And that's still a huge emphasis today.
Now, as we move closer to the present day, there's this strong emphasis on completing the Great Commission, right?
Yeah.
And the notes include some pretty striking figures, actually, from 1996, which I know is a while back now, but still.
Okay.
It says that the number of evangelical believers was growing at roughly 3 times the rate of the overall population growth.
Wow. 3 times. That's pretty significant.
Yeah. And the Southern Baptist International Mission Board, they reported a doubling of churches among their international partners in just 5 years.
That's incredible growth.
It is. And it kind of makes you wonder, where are we now? I mean, what do those numbers look like today?
Well, I think those figures from the mid-90s really captured a sense of momentum, They fueled this idea that maybe, just maybe, this long-held goal of reaching all people groups with the gospel, well, maybe it was actually within reach, closer than ever before.
Yeah, it's like that light at the end of the tunnel starts to feel a little brighter.
Exactly. And it really sets the stage for understanding all the different factors that are influencing missions today.
And that brings us to the 6 key factors that the notes outline: demographic, economic, political, technological, cultural, and religious.
It's the whole picture, really.
It is, and I got to say, some of it's a bit of a puzzle.
Okay.
Like, let's start with demographics, because
Okay.
you have this apparent growth in Christian witness, right?
Yeah.
But then the notes say there are actually more unreached people today than ever before, so how do we square that?
Well, it all comes down to the sheer scale of population growth. I mean, the total number of people on the planet has exploded.
So even if the percentage of Christians stays the same, the actual number of those who haven't heard the message continues to grow.
Exactly. So it's not just about reaching a certain percentage. It's about engaging with a constantly expanding global population.
That makes sense. And then there's the whole issue of nominalism.
Right. Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
People who might identify as Christian but aren't really living out their faith. And the notes emphasize the need for good discipleship, for strong leadership within churches.
That's key. And there's this great phrase in the notes. It says, God doesn't have any grandchildren.
I like that.
Yeah, it really drives home the point that faith is personal. It's not something you inherit. You have to own it.
Yeah, it has to be your own.
And I think that internal strength, within the church, it directly impacts its ability to reach out to others.
It's like you can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. You got to be filled up yourself first.
So moving on, another demographic point the notes highlight is the huge youth population in less developed countries.
Right. And that's a really strategic focus.
Back in 96, it said almost 45% of people in those areas were under the age of 15.
Wow, that's a lot of young people.
And the thinking is that younger generations might be more open to new ideas, to the gospel, compared to older generations who were more set in their ways.
Yeah, there's less of that, resistance to change.
The notes even mentioned Thailand as an example of shifting perspectives.
And that's really encouraging because if you can reach young people who are less bound by those traditional structures, well, that could have a massive impact on families and communities for years to come. I mean, that's how societies change.
That's long-term vision right there.
Definitely.
And then you have this whole massive trend of urbanization. I mean, the world is becoming increasingly urban.
It's a global phenomenon, no doubt.
The notes point out that in 1950, only one city in the world had over 10 million residents, but now there are 14.
Wow, that's a big jump.
And they say that number's going to double. We're talking about megacities like Mexico City and Tokyo with over 20 million people. It's mind-boggling.
It is. Those are like countries unto themselves.
Even in Latin America, a
Right.
huge percentage of the population lives in capital cities.
And then you have India and China. I mean, they've got dozens of cities with populations over 1 million.
It's a whole new world, literally.
Yeah, and for missions, this has to mean a whole new approach, right?
You can't just apply those old rural strategies to these massive, complex urban centers.
Absolutely not. These aren't just big villages. They're totally different beasts.
Yeah, and the notes talk about this concept of gateway cities, these strategically important urban centers that can be used as launching pads to reach entire people groups who are concentrated within them.
It's like finding those key points of leverage.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about economic factors.
Okay, another huge piece of the puzzle.
Because as these notes point out, the global economy is all interconnected. What happens in one part of the world impacts everyone else.
Yeah, it's a ripple effect.
So how does that reality influence missions?
Well, in a couple ways. I mean, on one hand, you have impoverished nations like Haiti or Bangladesh.
Right, where just basic survival is a daily struggle.
Exactly, and that creates immense challenges for people, but it also creates opportunities for ministry, to show compassion, to meet those tangible needs in a way that can open doors for the gospel.
Yeah, it's about meeting people where they're at.
Absolutely, but then you have this whole other trend, the rise of what the notes call two-thirds world economies.
So these are nations that are rapidly developing.
Right, they're becoming economic powerhouses, and the notes mention Indonesia, for example, with its rising income levels.
Yeah, and India, I mean, their middle class is massive and growing all the time.
And then you have the Pacific Rim economies. They're growing at a rate that dwarfs the Industrial Revolution in the West.
So this has to have an impact on how missions is funded, right?
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the traditional model of financial support flowing from the West to the rest of the world, that's changing.
So these emerging economies are becoming significant contributors.
They are, and it's exciting to see that shift, but the notes also point out a potential downside.
Okay, what's that?
Well, as wealth increases, there's also a risk of increased materialism and a decreased perceived need for spiritual things.
Yeah, I see. So it's almost like a double-edged sword.
Yeah, kind of. And the notes quote this Thai proverb. It says, "Rice in every field, but no rice in the heart for God."
Wow, that's pretty powerful.
It is, and it really captures that tension, between abundance and spiritual emptiness.
So what about the more affluent nations? How does economics play out there in terms of missions?
Well, one thing the notes mention is that strong local economies, coupled with currency devaluation, can actually make it really difficult to sustain a traditional missionary presence in places like Japan or Western Europe.
So it's like the cost of living becomes too high.
Exactly, and it forces a rethinking of how missions is carried out in those contexts.
And then there's this really intriguing thought experiment in the notes. It asks, what if Japan were evangelized?
Okay, I'm listening.
Because imagine, I mean, Japan has this huge global economic network, right?
Yeah, they're a major player on the world stage.
So if they were a predominantly Christian nation, the potential for influence through trade, through industry, it's almost mind-boggling.
It is, and it really makes you think about how influence for the gospel can manifest in so many different ways, not just through traditional missionary work.
Yeah, it's a much bigger picture than we often realize.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's dive into another complex area. Politics.
Oh boy. Yeah, politics, always a fun topic.
Because the notes describe this shift, from a time when missions often aligned with democratic nations or those friendly to the West to what they call political chaos, where you have the emergence of all these different autocratic regimes. And it's not just the old communist model anymore.
No, it's much more fragmented, less predictable.
So how does this instability, this unpredictability, how does it impact missions on the ground?
Well, I think the biggest thing is the fragmentation. It's no longer a clear-cut ideological battle between two superpowers.
Is more regional, more localized?
Right, and the notes point to the breakup of countries like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, and then you have all these ethnic nationalist movements popping up all over the world.
So it's a much more volatile and unpredictable environment for missions.
Absolutely, and it requires a different approach, a lot more sensitivity to local dynamics.
The notes specifically address ethnic violence in Africa.
Yeah, that's a tragic reality.
And how it impacts the safety of missionaries. And it seems like the drivers of conflict have shifted. It's not so much about ideology anymore.
Right.
It's about scarcity, about overpopulation, tribal tensions, and then, of course, you have the ongoing threat of disease.
It's a complex web of factors, and it makes mission work incredibly challenging and risky in many parts of the world.
So how do missionaries adapt to that reality?
Well, I think a big part of it is shifting the focus from direct evangelism to long-term community development, building trust, building relationships.
So more about laying a foundation.
Yeah, creating a space where the gospel can take root over time.
The notes also mention that while some political changes have created opportunities for missions, it's still a very precarious situation. Restrictions can be reimposed, even in places that were once more open. And we're seeing increasing limitations on direct witnessing in a lot of countries.
Especially in those with long-established world religions. So missionaries are having to find alternative approaches, be more creative.
It sounds like navigating the political landscape is a real tightrope walk.
It is, and the notes emphasize the need for wisdom, for discernment, and ultimately for a deep trust in God's sovereignty, because the political winds can change so quickly.
Yeah, there's only so much you can control.
Right, and sometimes it's about trusting that God is working even when we can't see it.
Okay, let's shift to something a bit more, I don't know, tangible maybe. Technology.
Ah, technology, that's where things get really interesting.
Because even since these notes were written in the mid-90s, I mean, the pace of technological advancement has been mind-blowing.
It has, it's exponential. And the notes themselves, they acknowledge the huge potential for missions, even in areas with very limited infrastructure.
So what were some of those early glimpses of how technology could revolutionize missions?
Well, I think one of the most significant things was the ability to transcend geographical and political barriers.
Hmm.
The notes mention the Billy Graham Crusades, for example, being broadcast via satellite with simultaneous translation into over 100 languages.
Wow, that's incredible reach.
It is, and then you have SAT-7 reaching audiences across the Arab world.
So suddenly you have this potential to reach millions of people with the gospel.
Yeah, and it's not just about numbers, it's about reaching people who might never otherwise have the opportunity to hear the message.
But the notes also point out a challenge with this kind of mass media outreach, right?
Yeah, the follow-up, how do you build relationships? How do you disciple people when your audience is so vast and often anonymous?
That's a great point. It's like you can plant seeds, but who's there to water them?
Exactly, and I think that's where we've seen a lot of innovation, using technology to facilitate those personal connections.
So electronic networks, things like that.
Yeah, the notes mention how those early networks were being used to connect missionaries, to share strategies, to even coordinate prayer support in real time.
So it's like creating a virtual mission control center.
Yeah, in a way, and of course the internet, which was still pretty new back then.
Right. It was just starting to emerge.
The notes recognized its huge potential for direct outreach, into what they called cyberspace.
So reaching people online in those virtual spaces.
Exactly, and that's only grown exponentially since then.
It has. And then you have the development of these simpler, more practical tools like solar-powered audio and video devices for remote areas.
It's about using technology to bridge those gaps, to reach people in the most effective way possible.
I love that.
And the great thing about technology is that it keeps getting cheaper, more accessible, so even those initial costs come down over time.
And ultimately, the notes emphasize that technology is a tool, right?
It is, it's an amplifier.
It can't replace the impact of a personal testimony, of a life lived out in faith.
Absolutely not, but it can extend the reach of that testimony in powerful ways.
Okay, let's talk about culture, because as the notes remind us, missions is fundamentally a cross-cultural endeavor.
It's all about reaching the nations. That's panteta ethne. And that mandate goes all the way back to Abraham.
Yeah, and it's woven throughout the teachings of Jesus.
It is. So when we're talking about navigating all these diverse cultural landscapes, what's the key ingredient for success?
Understanding, right?
Yeah, understanding. But it's more than just language. It's about worldview.
Yeah.
Grasping how people in a particular culture see the world, their beliefs about God, about sin, the afterlife, their values, their rituals.
It's like seeing the world through their eyes.
Exactly, because without that deep level of cultural empathy, the gospel can easily be misconstrued or even rejected.
The notes mention the shrinking global community, with increased travel, the spread of English as a common language.
Right, but they also caution against assuming that means everyone understands each other.
So it's not about cultural homogeneity, it's about recognizing and respecting those differences.
Exactly, and globalization can create this illusion of sameness, especially if your exposure is limited to those short-term mission trips.
Yeah, it's like you can't truly grasp a culture in a week or two.
No way, and the notes really emphasize the need for mission strategies that are culturally sensitive, that allow the gospel to be expressed authentically within each unique cultural context.
They even use this phrase, minimal foreignness.
Which I think is a great way to put it, because the goal is not to impose a foreign culture, but to allow the gospel to take root and grow organically within the existing cultural soil.
Yeah, it's like planting a seed that can flourish in its native environment.
Exactly.
Okay, last but not least, religious factors.
Yes, the ever-evolving world of religion.
Because the notes present this conflicting paradox, as they call it.
Okay, what's the paradox?
Well, you have this simultaneous growth and influence of established world religions alongside a rising tide of secularization. So it's like these two opposing forces at play.
It is, and I think it reflects the tension of the modern world, this pull between tradition and modernity.
So on one hand, you have the resurgence of fundamentalism.
Yeah, in various forms within Islam, for example.
The notes mention examples like the Taliban.
Right, and that has huge social and political implications. And you also see this in Hinduism, these renewal movements that are often intertwined with national identity.
And then in traditionally Buddhist regions, there can be strong social pressures that create barriers to Christian growth.
Absolutely. Even if there's individual interest or curiosity, those cultural barriers can be very real.
But the notes also point to some encouraging signs, this softening of hearts in some of these traditionally resistant areas.
It's like those walls start to crumble a
Yeah.
bit.
And they talk about how when effective channels of communication are found, even within those strongholds of other religions, the gospel can find a foothold.
It's about finding those points of connection, those shared human experiences, because often those underlying spiritual needs are very similar.
And the notes quote this North African missionary who talks about abundant sowing leading to abundant harvest in the Muslim world.
I love that. It's a message of hope, of perseverance.
It is, but then you have this counter trend of secularization, driven by economic development, by materialism.
Right, and that can lead to indifference, to apathy, especially among young people who are growing up in a world that seems to have all the answers.
So it's this complex interplay of forces, some pushing towards faith, others towards a more secular worldview.
And that's the reality of the world we live in, a world of competing narratives.
So the notes go on to identify some key trends that are shaping the current landscape of missions.
Okay, let's dig into those.
And the first one is what they call the people group approach.
That's a really important shift.
It sounds a lot more focused than just trying to reach entire nations.
It is. It's about recognizing that even within a single country, there can be numerous distinct people groups, each with their own language, their own culture, their own way of seeing the world.
It's that pantete ethne from Scripture again.
Right, reaching the nations. And the notes point out that in countries like India, China, Indonesia, even with all the mission efforts over the years, there are still many of these specific people groups that haven't been effectively reached.
So it's about getting much more granular.
Yeah, about identifying and understanding those over 14,000 distinct people groups and then tailoring mission strategies accordingly.
It's like a laser focus rather than a floodlight.
Exactly. And I think that's key for making real progress.
Another trend the notes highlight is prayer as strategy.
Okay, prayer, that's the foundation of everything, right?
It is, but the notes describe something a bit more, active. They talk about prayer as engaging with spiritual forces, what some people call spiritual warfare.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept, and it's not just about praying for things to happen.
It's about recognizing that there are spiritual forces at play that can hinder the spread of the gospel.
It's almost like praying to break down those strongholds, to clear the way for the message to be heard.
And the notes even reference Jesus' temptation, where Satan claims authority over the kingdoms of the world.
It's a reminder that we're not just fighting flesh and blood, but spiritual powers as well.
So how does this understanding of prayer shape mission efforts?
Well, for one thing, it leads to a much more intentional and focused approach to prayer.
So praying for specific people groups, for specific regions?
Yeah, and the notes mention prayer journeys where people actually go to key locations and pray.
I've heard of that.
And they talk about miraculous breakthroughs that have occurred as a result of this kind of focused prayer.
So it's not just a passive activity, it's seen as a powerful weapon in the spiritual battle.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really important perspective to understand.
Okay, let's talk about the charismatic impact, because the notes highlight this rapid growth of charismatic and Pentecostal movements globally.
Oh, yeah, that's been a major force. And it's interesting because a lot of this growth happened spontaneously, outside of those traditional mission structures.
So more organic, more grassroots.
Exactly, and we've seen the emergence of megachurches, the growth of cell groups, these very effective models for outreach and discipleship.
The notes mention Peter Wagner's third wave. Can you explain that a bit?
Sure. The third wave is basically this idea that charismatic beliefs and practices have moved beyond those traditional Pentecostal denominations.
So it's spreading into other parts of the church.
Yeah, into mainline Protestant churches, even some Catholic churches, and it's often more integrated, more subtle, It's not necessarily about speaking in tongues or anything like that.
But about an openness to the supernatural, to spiritual gifts.
Right. And I think the impact of these movements is undeniable. I mean, the notes point to significant growth in places like Latin America.
And the emergence of these thriving churches all over the world.
And these churches often have a few things in common: a strong emphasis on prayer, a real zeal for witnessing, and a faith that expects God to work in powerful ways.
So signs and wonders, miracles, those sorts of things.
Yeah, and I think that's a really attractive message for a lot of people.
It's a message of hope, of possibility.
Absolutely.
Okay, so another trend the notes highlight is national leadership.
Ah, that's a really crucial one, especially as we move away from that, old colonial model of missions.
Right. The notes acknowledge that historically there's been a paternalistic element to missions, but they emphasize this shift towards self-supporting, self-governing national churches.
Yeah, it's about empowering local leaders, recognizing their authority and their ability to lead effectively.
So true partnership, not just Western missionaries calling the shots.
Exactly. And the notes talk about the nationalization of institutions like seminaries and hospitals, and that's a really positive sign.
So what does this mean for the role of traditional missionaries?
I think it means a shift from a directive role to a more supportive role,
Yeah.
mentorship, collaboration, really coming alongside national leaders with the servant heart.
So less about going in and fixing things and more about empowering and equipping.
Exactly. And I think that requires a lot of humility and a willingness to let go of control.
Yeah. It's a different mindset.
It is, but I think it's a healthy one. And ultimately, it's what leads to sustainable long-term growth.
Okay, following on that, we have internationalization factors.
Right. And this is where things get really exciting.
Because it's no longer just about missionaries going from the West to the rest of the world.
No, it's a two-way street now.
The notes point to a rapidly growing number of missionaries coming from two-thirds world countries.
And the projections suggest that they'll soon outnumber Western missionaries.
That's a pretty amazing shift.
It is, and it makes sense because these missionaries often have significant advantages.
Like what?
Well, they understand the culture, they speak the language, they can navigate those complex social and political landscapes in ways that Westerners often struggle with.
It's like they have insider knowledge.
Yeah, and the notes mention mission-sending movements in places like Brazil and South Korea, which are incredible examples of this trend.
And then there's the fact that these missionaries can often gain access to countries that are more restrictive towards Westerners.
Absolutely, so it opens up new possibilities for reaching those who are most isolated.
It's like the gospel is finding new pathways.
And it's not just about individuals, it's about forming truly multinational mission teams.
So you have people from all over the world working together.
Yeah, pooling their resources, their expertise, their cultural insights.
It's a beautiful picture of unity and diversity.
It is, and I think it shows that missions is no longer solely a Western responsibility.
It's a global effort, everyone working together.
Exactly, and that has huge implications for completing the Great Commission.
Now, here's a trend that's a little more, I don't know, unexpected.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
The notes declare the ecumenical movement as largely defunct.
So the push for unity among different Christian denominations.
Right, which is a big deal in the early 20th century. The idea was to reduce confusion, to pool resources, to present a more united front.
Yeah, the Edinburgh Conference in 1910 was a key moment in that movement.
And the notes mention these comity agreements, where denominations would divvy up territory to avoid overlap.
So why didn't it work out?
Well, the notes suggest that while the desire for unity was sincere, it often ended up prioritizing organizational structures over core doctrinal convictions.
So like focusing on unity for the sake of unity rather than unity around the gospel.
Exactly. And the anticipated evangelistic impact just didn't materialize.
It's like the emphasis shifted from spreading the gospel to just getting everyone on the same page organizationally.
And it seems like the current trend is actually moving in the opposite direction.
So more emphasis on denominational distinctives.
Yeah, and the notes suggest that those churches and denominations that hold firmly to their beliefs are actually the ones that are seeing the most growth and effectiveness.
Which makes sense. I mean, people are drawn to conviction, to authenticity.
But even if full unity isn't the goal, do you think there's still value in interdenominational cooperation?
Oh, absolutely, especially for things like disaster relief or addressing social justice issues, where collaboration can have a much greater impact.
So it's like finding that balance between unity and diversity.
Right, recognizing that we can work together on those things we agree on without compromising our core convictions.
Another significant trend is the parachurch movement.
Ah, those specialized mission organizations, they play a really unique role.
Yeah, we're talking about groups like Wycliffe Bible Translators, Trans World Radio, Campus Crusade for Christ, the Navigators, all sorts of different ministries.
They've been around for a long time, but the notes point out that there's been a real proliferation of these organizations in recent decades.
So what's driving that growth?
Well, I think it's partly a response to the changing landscape of missions. As some mainline churches shifted their focus away from overseas work, these parachurch organizations stepped in to fill those gaps.
So they're providing specialized expertise, things like Bible translation, media outreach, student ministry, all sorts of areas.